Cultural Glare, welcome everybody to the Talent Historical Society and our lecture this evening, which is given to us by Dr. Nora White, the Ogham in 3D project, or as the Yanks might say, the Ogham. Yeah, Ogham stones and all that. Admittedly, it is a hard word to pronounce if you're not Irish or living on the island. In any case, before we get into that and the very interesting lecture this evening, we just mentioned normal housekeeping. If you just knock your phones onto silent, please. And I know there's no rudeness intended if it rings out. We're not going to shoot anybody if it does. Well, maybe. And might. In the event of a fire, if you follow me out through that back door there and away to the left, or alternatively I might run that way to the right and through that door. Just keep on running, okay? We'll meet up in the car park somewhere, maybe over in Grumpy's. And we've just mentioned here, there's a box at the back of the hall for donations. Our lecture next month is going to be Neil Jackman is returning to us about the Hellfire Club. So you want to book your seats early for that one, guys, because I remember first time round we couldn't get yous out of the building asking questions. And in the meantime, we have a little book there at the back of the hall. And if anybody wants to receive a text message as regards any changes in the lecture, the running of last week with that, why didn't we go ahead with the lecture last week? What? Yeah, I was at home watching a terrible lecture on football. Oh my God, it was one of the worst nights of my life. I would have loved them to come down here. So if you want to receive text in connection with the lectures, if you leave your name and mobile phone number on there, and she'll text you about 3 o'clock in the morning and wake you up and give you a call about all kinds of exciting things that are happening. So in the meantime, I'd just like to introduce to you Dr. Nora White. I'm sure you're going to give her a wonderful warm reception.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for the invitation to come and speak here tonight. I I'm principal investigator on the Ogham 3D project, and at the moment we're based at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. And I suppose I'll tell you a bit more about the Ogham 3D project in a little while, but I'll start by talking about, I suppose, a general introduction to Ogham. And Ogham, in the general sense, is quite a broad and complex subject, which encompasses many different academic disciplines, including archaeology, Celtic and Irish linguistics, history and genealogy. The Ogham alphabet has been around for a very long time and has been used for a number of different purposes, from prehistoric times when it was first created, through the medieval period, and even still today, for example by craftspeople such as jewellers, who use the Ogham alphabet to create personalised jewellery, and it's still something that's very popular today. There are other less usual uses and modern beliefs around Ogham that I won't go into this evening. Because of this long and continually changing tradition, information on Ogham can sometimes be confusing or even contradictory. So if you go online, you can find lots of different Ogham alphabets and different traditions to do with Ogham. And because interest has continued over the years, it has branched out in all kinds of different directions, and it gets quite complex. So what I'm going to do today is bring it back to the origins and to the early inscriptions on stone, because that's mainly what I'm interested in and what I work on. So by the time you go home tonight, I hope that you will have gained some sense of the origins of Ogham, insofar as we can tell, and its earliest attested functions in Ireland, and how it survived into the Middle Ages in an adapted form for very different purposes, which misled many into believing the myth of a tree alphabet. So, before writing in manuscripts began in Ireland, the script we call Ogham, or Ogham as it actually probably was known in early Ireland, this script was used to write short inscriptions on stone, and probably also on other less durable materials such as wood or bone, which haven't survived, or at least none have been found yet from this early period. The script was created specifically for the sounds of the Irish language of the time, and is the earliest written form of Irish, described as primitive Irish. We have over 400 known examples of Ogham stones of various stone types, shapes and sizes, and each one has its own story. And I could actually spend the hour tonight just talking about one individual Ogham stone and its story and the inscription and where it was found and where it was moved to and when it was recorded. And there's so much on each one. You could actually spend a whole hour talking on just one stone, but I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm just going to give you a general overview. So just to say that this Ogham stone you're looking at here is from Loch East, near Dingle in County Kerry. It was the first Ogham stone discovered or recognised as an Ogham stone in the 1700s in Ireland, and it was originally standing upright when it was found close to the sea in what appears to have been a burial ground. A little bit closer. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. That's better. Okay, I wasn't close enough.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was found upright in what appears to have been a burial ground near the sea, and it may have been an early church site, but it now lies on this especially made plinth on the beach at Trobeg, I think it is, near Dingle in County Kerry. So Ogham stones like this one were presumably used as memorials, possibly marking burials, although we have yet to find archaeological evidence to support this. And it's not that, there may be evidence there, but not enough archaeological excavations have been done at Ogham sites. Now, many of these sites, I mentioned that this one was found in the 1700s. Most of them were found in the 19th and early 20th century. So at the time, they very often moved them from where they found them. There are about 50 or so in the National Museum collection, and there are another 28 in the UCC collection. So all of those were taken from their original locations, and the original locations weren't recorded in the way that we would record them today, scientifically, with archaeological excavation, etc. So we don't have the archaeological context often that we would like to have for Ogham stones. So hopefully, at some stage in the future, we will be able to get some funding to excavate an Ogham stone that we are fairly sure it's in its original location, because it can sometimes be hard to tell. Okay, so let's see where I was. So they may also have been used as boundary markers, as quite often they are found at or near ancient boundaries, and also indicators of land ownership. And we have references in later law tracts which suggest that Ogham stones had a legal function in disputes over land, in that they were considered, in translation, witnesses who fixed truth. So I suppose like the expression written in stone, because it was something that was carved in stone, they considered it something that was evidence of ownership of land. So Ogham stones are found in most counties in Ireland, but they occur in by far the highest numbers in the southwest, in counties Kerry, Cork and Waterford. The Dingle Peninsula has the highest concentration, with approximately 60 Ogham stones originating in this small area. Outside of Ireland, Ogham stones are also found in areas where the Irish settled, in particular in Wales, the Isle of Man, Devon and Cornwall, down the southwest, and in Scotland. Ogham stones or inscriptions are found carved on a variety of archaeological monuments, such as standing stones, stones in stone circles, stone rows and megalithic tombs, as well as on stones found in mounds, promontory forts, ring forts and ecclesiastical enclosures. So while most Ogham stones may have been put up for the purpose of inscribing them, some of the stones were already in place and the Ogham inscription was then put on afterwards. So the stones may have had significance beforehand, especially some of our larger Ogham stones. These are probably dating back to Bronze Age standing stones that were later reused again with and inscriptions put on them. Unfortunately, many Ogham inscriptions have been partially eroded by weathering or otherwise damaged over the years, and some are now difficult or impossible to decipher. This is often because of the location of the inscription on the vulnerable edge of the stone, and they are often still in the landscape used by cattle as scratching posts. So obviously that's not great for the inscription. And also you have the breaking up of Ogham stones in later centuries for reuse in souterrains or other buildings, although those reused in souterrains, which are underground chambers, passages, underground storage areas, were at least less weathered and lichen covered than those left in the landscape. So some of you probably know exactly what souterrains were, but just an artist drawing there just to give you an idea. Quite a lot of ring forts in those days, which were the habitation sites, the farms of the time, would have had souterrains, underground chambers like this, where they stored food or they took refuge in times of conflict, etc. And very often you find Ogham stones reused in souterrains as building material, as mini lintels, but sometimes upright stones as well. So Ogham stones in Ireland are quite frequently found reused, primarily in souterrains, actually over 40% of the total. And most of the Cork stones in particular were found in this way. For example, there was one souterrain site in County Cork. I can't remember the townland name now, but it was one of the County Cork souterrains. 15 Ogham stones were found in one souterrain. 11 of those are now on display in UCC, and I think three of them were left on site. Another significant percentage is that more than 40% of Ogham stones are found at or near early church sites. And these are often also close to ancient boundaries and possibly our formal ancestral burial sites. So the problem is that stones that we find at early church sites, we don't know if the church was there first and the stone was moved in later, which happened in Wales, or whether the Ogham stone was there and the marking maybe an ancient burial ground and the church then came and set up there later. So it can be hard to tell. Okay, so what is actually written in Ogham inscriptions and on Ogham stones? Well, the inscriptions are brief and mainly consist of personal names in the genitive case, which means that another word is to be understood before the name. So something like stone of, name of, or even territory of. Frequently the father's name and even the name of the kindred or ancestor is added. There are a number of formula words used, the most frequent being Mockery, meaning son, modern Irish. The tribal affiliation is expressed by Awi, meaning grandson or remote descendant, modern Irish O, or Mukoi, meaning descendant or kindred, followed by the name of the eponymous ancestor. Mukoi doesn't survive into the modern language, as it was replaced by a number of different terms and suffixes in the early medieval period. Other less frequent formula words include onum, meaning name or possibly an inscription, which was placed at the beginning of the inscription. Koi, which means here, or maybe something like here lies, corresponding to Iaset on British inscriptions, and Kela, meaning companion or client, usually positioned just before the kin group name. So the layout then would be name of Fergus or whoever here, son of Y, client of the descendant of Z. In just one or two inscriptions, the station of life is given in addition to the names. For example, on the Arid Len stone found on Mount Brandon in County Kerry, you have an inscription which reads, of the priest Ronan, son of Covhon. Now this is unusual, but it does show, and also if you see there's a cross on the face there, and there's actually another cross on the other side of the stone as well on the other face. So we're certainly in the Christian period at this stage, and they're commemorating an actual priest. Now this inscription is relatively late. It would be probably late 6th century. With regard to the kin group or ancestor names, it is interesting to find that all but one of the inscriptions containing the ancestor deity name Divinius, Mokai Divinius meaning descendants of Divna, have been found in the barony of Porcagina on the Dingle Peninsula, which got its name from that same kin group. So I mentioned before that Mokoi fell out of use in the Old Irish period as a term meaning descendant of, and one of the terms that took over was Curca. So Curcagina is exactly the same as saying Mokoi Divinius in the primitive language. So this demonstrates, I suppose, the importance of both home inscriptions and place names in preserving the names of early population groups in Ireland. In its earliest form, the Ogham alphabet consisted of 4 groups of 5 characters or letters each, giving a total of 20 characters representing the sounds of the Irish language of the period. The characters are made up of between 1 and 5 lines or scores relative to a stem line, with 2 of the groups distinguished by the orientation of the scores. So N is 5 scores to the right, whereas the Q is 5 scores to the left. The third group crosses the stem line diagonally, and the fourth group consists of 1 to 5 notches on the stem line representing the vowels. Now, sometimes they are actual notches and they're very distinct from the consonant scores, but other times the vowels are actually kind of like shorter scores and it can be hard to distinguish. So there's a lot of variation in how Ogham is carved. And for example, there seems to be a Cork style. Now it's not just found in Cork, but it seems to be mostly found in Cork, which is almost like the scores are almost scraped with something very pointed and fine. Whereas other types of carving in other areas you will find very broad, deep scores that have been picked with a pick chisel, point chisel. So there are very different techniques used for carving Ogham, and there seems to be some regional variation in there as well. An additional 5th group of 5 supplementary characters, known as forfida, are included in the later manuscript tradition on Ogham. However, only one of these occurs frequently on inscriptions on stone and appears as 2 diagonal scores crossing each other on the stem line. So you can maybe see what looks like an X there on the stone. This character is used with 2 values. The first, a consonant, usually transliterated K, as we have here in the Celbrity. So you'd be reading the stone from right to left here, because if it was upright, it would be reading from the bottom up. And the second value is the vowel E, although it is only found used as a vowel in the relatively recent inscriptions. So it seems to have first been a K sound, and then later it was a vowel. All inscriptions on stone generally use the natural arris or edge of the stone as a stem line for the characters. And now in this case, you don't actually have an edge on the stone because it's a rounded, it's a water rolled stone from a storm beach nearby. This is from, again, on the Dingle Peninsula, from Minard Storm Beach. But they still position, even though there's no actual angle on this stone, they still position the inscription to the edge where an angle would be if there was an angle. But you can see it much clearer in this one, from Ardmore in County Waterford. So the inscription starts at the bottom left-hand side of one of the faces, on the angle then, and reads upwards across the top and down the right-hand side, and so on. Now in this case, the inscription is quite long and it continues on 3 of the 4 angles of the stone. And you can see the way it wraps around the actual angle there, using the angle as the stem line. So I said it goes up the left-hand side, across the top and down the right. But there is, again, variation on this pattern. You find some inscriptions that read upward on both edges, on 2 or more edges, and others that read up the right-hand side and down the left, so in the opposite direction. And very occasionally you find inscriptions on the face of the stone, but these are the exception. Ogham inscriptions are generally dated to between the 4th and the 7th centuries AD. A lack of excavation at Ogham sites means that we have little or no means of dating the inscriptions or the stones by archaeological evidence. The linguistic evidence only allows us to roughly order the inscriptions chronologically and gives us an approximate date of the 7th century AD for the latest inscriptions, as the Irish in these is very close to that of the earliest Irish found in manuscripts. And then as we go back along, we can trace the development of the language. So we can see which inscriptions are the earliest, because we can see a clear development in the language. For example, you have the loss of finite syllables. You can see here, for example, in this one, you can see up the top here, the inscription reads Moqui Caratini, which we think was later then Mock Carthan. So you can see you've lost the I of Moqui, you've lost the I at the end of Caratini. So these are the first stages of development from primitive Irish, where they lose the endings. So that's just an example of that. But we can then kind of roughly put these inscriptions in order chronologically. We can say, well, this one is earlier because it still has its ending. This one is late because it looks very like Old Irish, etc. However, a start date, even a rough one, for the application of Ogham script to stone is more difficult to determine. The standard estimate is late 4th or early 5th century. But earlier dating cannot be ruled out. It is also clear from the earliest known inscriptions that Ogham was already well established as a script with a consistent alphabet and orthography by the time they were carved. And you've seen already that some of the early inscriptions already have this X forfeit, which was a supplementary or extra character that was added to the alphabet, and these are already on the early inscriptions. So we can see that by the time they're carving these inscriptions, the alphabet is already very well developed and is adding new characters. Which means that the alphabet must be at least a few centuries older than the earliest surviving inscriptions. And if we say conservatively that they're 4th century, then that's pushing back the origins of the alphabet into the early centuries AD. And this for me is what makes Ogham stones one of our most intriguing and important monuments. They are a unique written link with our prehistoric ancestors and the form of Irish they spoke and eventually wrote, or rather carved. So although the practice of carving Ogham on stone largely died out once writing in manuscripts became established in around the 7th century, the Ogham alphabet continued with a new function in manuscripts such as the 14th century book of Ballymotier. Each of the Ogham characters or letters had names, which were meaningful words in the language. So unlike in the Latin alphabet, the ABC, these letter names have no other meaning other than ABC. But in Ogham they did. And we think that this is what was of interest to medieval scribes, was these letter names that helped them. It was a way of remembering the sequence of sounds in the language. So it's mainly with regard to these letter names that the Ogham alphabet survived and formed the basis of training for poets and scholars, evidence in texts such as Aurcach na Negus, meaning the scholar's primer. The letter names were probably originally coined for the primitive Irish sounds to be represented by the Ogham alphabet. So these letter names are probably quite old. However, changes in the language over time inevitably led to the loss of some of the original values of letters and the meanings of their names. The later manuscript sources supply a key to the alphabet, in which all of the letters named are interpreted as names of trees or shrubs. In the early days of modern Ogham scholarship, these meanings were taken at face value, which led to the belief that the Ogham alphabet was based solely on the names of trees. However, more recent work, mainly by Damien McManus in his Guide to Ogham, and also an article specifically dealing with letter names and their keenings. And keenings, these are kind of like clues or riddles that were to help with the understanding of the original meaning of the names. So they do actually help in a way to establish the original meanings of the names. So these have shown that while some of the names have survived more or less intact, others were either misinterpreted or lost and replaced by artificial forms. So there are 4 groups, or acme, meaning family, class or group, in Irish, which are named after the initial character or letter of each group. So the acme betha is the B group, Acma Utha, Acma Mwina, and Acma Elma. The characters or letters are generally termed feda, the plural of fid, meaning wood or tree. The stem line, drim, meaning ridge, edge or back. And a single score is called flesk, meaning a twig. So further tree associations in the Fortunately, our earliest and least contaminated source, manuscript source, on the form and meaning of the letter names is a text called Irish Ogham, which means word Ogham, and it helps us to establish many, though unfortunately not all, of the original values and meanings. So I'll just go through these fairly quickly, because if anyone is interested in looking at them in detail, you can look at McManus's article, or even on our own Omen 3D website. I have a list of the names that we think the original letter names would have had. So some of them are trees, and the first one most certainly is, and it survives even into modern Irish as the name of the birch tree, but others are not. And the second one there, lush, we think probably meant something like flame, blaze, or possibly a similar word meaning plant or herb. Then we have farn, or modern Irish farn oak, which is the alder tree. So again, it has survived into the modern language. But there has been one change, and that is with the initial sound, and that by Old Irish it was already a f, so you have farn. But in Old Irish that was a w, or in Primitive Irish, on the inscriptions that would have been a w, and it would have been written v. So that's why sometimes when you see an alphabet it has a v, and other times it has an f. I here have both, because I just want to show that the V of the Ogham inscriptions later became an F in Old Irish. So again, the S, sal, the willow tree, which again survives into modern Irish. The nin, we're not sure what the original etymology of that word is, what it might have meant originally, possibly fork. But as well as meaning the letter N, it came to generally mean letters. So the next group then, Acma Utha, and the first letter in this group, the H, is a problematic one. This seems to have been borrowed from Latin, because there's a gap here. Well, I mean, uth, meaning, in the later tradition it means white-thorn tree, but we don't know what the original letter name was. If it did begin with it had to have begun with a consonant, because it's in a consonant group, so it couldn't be uth. So that one was put in the later period, because they no longer had the original sound. It had been lost in the language. So that one is very problematic. We don't know really what it originally was. Dar, oak tree, that has survived into the modern language. Tinna is fairly straightforward as well. It means bar, rod of metal, or ingot. But so this shows that not all of them were trees. Cull, meaning hazel tree, again survives. And then the next one then, in Old Irish this would have been curt, meaning bush. And of course you then have two C's, so how do you distinguish these two in the Old Irish? And the thing is that they couldn't, because the sound had changed. It was originally qu in the Primitive Irish period, so you had a difference between the C and the Q. There was a k and a qu, and later they just fell together as k in Old Irish, so they no longer had a distinction between the two. The Acma Mwina then, win meaning the neck, Gurt meaning field, and then we have a second and third problematic letter. NG and Z appear to have been borrowed again from Latin, because they had lost the original sounds, which again, Gurt and Gaetal, we can't have two G's there, so it has to be something else. So it might have been something like G that fell together with G later on, so they tried to come up with something that would fill the gap. And the final one then, rouge, meaning redness. And the final group then, the vowels, the Acma Elma. Alm, it's said to mean pine tree, and there has been one attestation outside of the Ogham alphabet to it being a pine tree, but it's not the usual word used for pine tree, so we're not really sure on that one. It's a possibility, but it's hard to be certain on it. On, meaning ash tree, even though that the word for an ash tree has changed, and in modern Irish it's from show. But it has a cognate in Welsh, so we're pretty sure that this was the primitive name for an ash tree, so we're pretty sure the ash tree is on. Although in the later tradition, the ash tree is given for another letter of the alphabet. Ur meaning earth, clay or soil is fairly straightforward. But the final two, the E and the I, the names given in the manuscripts are Edad and Edad, but these they're actually unclear, and they do look to be artificially paired in some way. The experts tell us that it may have been, well, it had to be a name starting with E for Edad and I for Idad. So it possibly the I could have originally been Ewas, meaning yew tree. So that's again certainly not definite. So just to overview with regard to the names of trees, there are actually only 6 that we're fairly certain of that were originally tree names, with two further that may have been. So why did they rename them all trees in the Old Irish period? Well, I suppose they saw that so many were tree names, and a lot of the terminology around Ogham is to do with trees, so they probably decided it would be easier to make them all trees, and they just they didn't have the same concept that we would have of, something has to be authentic, and you have to be able to show that it was originally this. They didn't mind changing things and saying, right, this is the way it is from now on, and that's it. So unfortunately, we have to be careful when we're looking at manuscript sources like this. Okay, where are we now? So I want to return again to the Ogham inscriptions on stone, and to tell you a little about the work of the Ogham 3D project. As medieval scholars themselves recognised when they described Ogham stones as witnesses who fixed truth, these are actually our only examples of truly reliable evidence for the sounds of primitive Irish, and therefore also the original letter names, as well as their earlier functions, which appear to have been bound up with society's relationships between kin groups and their relationship with the landscape in which they inhabited. So unlike most inscriptions on stone, which are generally found on the flat face of the stone, the manner in which the Ogham scores wrap around the edge or arras of the stone makes it, uniquely as far as I'm aware, a three-dimensional script. And this is why 3D visualization is ideal for Ogham stones. The aims of the Ogham in 3D project are to use 3D technology to record as many as possible of the surviving stones, to make the inscriptions, the stones and the sites more accessible to researchers and to the general public by developing a searchable Ogham website including descriptions, photographs, maps and 3D models of the stones. Then to use the 3D data to assist where possible in the reading of weathered and worn inscriptions, to facilitate analysis of individual carving techniques and tools, and to monitor the rate of weathering. So if we went back and recorded, scanned the Ogham stones again in, say, 5 or 10 years' time, we could see if there was any more damage or weathering on the inscriptions. So from 2012 to 2015, the project was funded by the former Department of Arts, Heritage and Gaeltacht, which is now Culture, Heritage and Gaeltacht, through the National Monument Service. We also benefited hugely from collaboration with the Discovery Programme, whose expertise in 3D capture and modelling has proven to be invaluable. So as a result, the Ogham 3D website, which was launched in 2013, is a work in progress. It currently has 140 Ogham records available, over a third of the known numbers surviving in Ireland. The 3D models are added as soon as they are processed, along with maps, photographs, any relevant linguistic information on the inscription, as well as descriptions of the stone and site, so the archaeological context, with links to their equivalent records on the Archaeological Survey of Ireland. Colleagues at the Discovery Programme have been working on advanced visualization techniques and using a 3D platform called Sketchfab to allow the results to be embedded into the website. So you have 3D models there that you can download PDF versions, but you can now also view the 3D models directly on the website, and you can make it full screen. So this new development allows for visually enhanced 3D models to be viewed instantaneously and easily manipulated, rotated, zoom in, etc. And many of the more recently captured Ogham stones can now be viewed in this way. So I suppose the main thing is to make them more accessible to people, and I know very well from my own fieldwork in trying to get to stones to record them that many of them are very difficult to access. They're in out-of-the-way places, very often on private land. Even those that are in museums, like in the National Museum collection, they're in storage and they're not easily accessible to the general public. So what we want to do is make them accessible and let people be able to freely view them and look at them. And I mean, very often we don't even have photographs of them. So we're trying to rectify that and make them accessible to be used by anyone, not just researchers, but anyone interested in their heritage. The website is also gradually developing as a research and teaching tool, with new search options frequently being added. So the Ogham records can currently be searched by personal names found in the inscriptions, formula words, site types, the presence of crosses and other features, and by McManus's relative chronology of linguistic features, so you can get a rough idea of the development of the language. We also have the added ability to, we have also added the ability to map the search results in order to visualize the geographical distribution of particular searches. So I was saying that a lot of the Ogham stones are found in suzerains in County Cork, for example. So another search would be, for example, if you did a search on the king group name Divinius, you would get then the resulting list of the stones that have the name Divinius, and they would also be plotted then on the map to show you the locations that they're found in, and in this case they're all found on the Dingle Peninsula. Antiquarian and other early accounts, drawings and photographs are also being utilised, particularly in cases of missing Ogham stones or Ogham stones no longer at their original find site. So this particular one, for example, is from Loch Roy in County Waterford. It was recorded by R.A.S. McAllister in 1907 at Salterbridge House in County Waterford. But when he went back in the 1940s to have another look at the inscription, it was gone, lost. So all we have now is that photograph that he took, and there are numerous examples of this. So we can't obviously 3D scan those now, but we can digitally copy the images and make them available. So we have something left of that stone. We have the inscription, we know what it read, and we have that old photograph. So to actually record the Ogham stones in 3D, I've just got a few slides just to show you what the setup looks like in the field. So the scanner we mainly use for the Ogham stones is the Discovery's Arctic Ava, which is a handheld structured light scanner capable of high resolution capture and the ability to generate texture, or to record the colour of the stone. Because in earlier days when we started out, we had another scanner, and we only got it in 2009 or 2010, but it was already obsolete by 2012, because the new scanners can now record texture, whereas our old one couldn't. So we couldn't even give it away now because it's of no use having anymore. So in the field then, we have to use a blackout tent to keep out light, because the handheld scanners are very sensitive to light. So, which is fine if you're working indoors, but if you're out in the field, with no shelter, you need a blackout tent. You also need a generator to run the equipment, your scanner and your laptop. So that's what the setup looks like on site. So you can imagine the locals were wondering at times what in the name of God is going on over there in the field. So in cases where the Ogham stone is too large to scan with the handheld scanner, where they don't fit inside the blackout tent, we use another piece of equipment which is a terrestrial scanner, and this is generally used for larger monuments such as buildings. The resolution is not as high as with the handheld scanners, but the range is much greater and is not as sensitive to light. So we also use the scanner where the site of the Ogham stone or stones have other archaeological remains, such as a church or a suzerain. The data collected can then be used to generate 3D animations or fly-throughs, which facilitate virtual tours of the sites, which can put the stones in their wider archaeological context. And we have some examples of fly-throughs on our website. For example, Kilmaine Cader, the church here on the Dingle Peninsula in County Kerry, which has an Ogham stone and a couple of other carved stones as well. Ardmore in County Waterford is another one where we have a fly-through. And a very interesting souterrain in North Kerry called Rathkenny, which is also on the website, and there's a little video there that shows what the souterrain looks like inside and where the Ogham stones are. It's one worth checking out. So, following recent advances in the capabilities of 3D software to more quickly and accurately produce 3D models from photographs, we started to test this alternative 3D capture method in the last few years. The advantages of using photogrammetry are that a digital camera and the processing software are the only equipment essentially required for this method. It is suited to working in daylight, unlike the 3D scanners, although it works best without strong sunlight, so you don't want shadows. An overcast day is ideal for this, which works well in Ireland. This means that it is far more cost-effective than laser or structured light scanning, which is an important consideration in these days when funding is difficult to come by. It also means that anyone with a digital camera, a basic knowledge of photography and basic IT skills can produce a 3D model themselves with just a small amount of training. The basic idea is that you photograph the stone from every angle. You walk around the stone taking photographs from different heights, and the photographs need to be overlapping by quite a bit. And then once you upload these to the software, you can then stitch the photographs together to make a 3D model. So that's very simply how it's done. So I suppose the better the equipment you have and the more time you spend, the more photographs you take, etc., the better the resulting model will be. But it is possible to create a 3D model even with a simple camera and a mobile phone, and it has been done. But this has allowed us to commence a new phase in the project, focusing on community engagement with Ogham stones. The pilot project, currently running in Kirkcalina on the Dingle Peninsula, facilitates local participation in the project, learning new skills and gaining a better understanding and appreciation of Ogham stones, which will in turn lead to a better protection and preservation for these important monuments. The project has developed and expanded, reflecting the interests of the participants. For example, although many Ogham stones are being captured and digitised, a number of other carved stones have been included, mainly rock art, cross-inscribed stones, and also some gravestones. One of the participants has contributed his skills in website design so that the project has its own website, and others manage a Facebook page. An article in Archaeology Ireland last summer, I think it was, highlighted new discoveries from the project, and more have come to light since. So I'll finish up now with this slide, just showing how we can digitally reconstruct broken Ogham stones using 3D technology. And this was a stone found in a souterrain in County Cork. It was broken into 3 pieces and 3 fragments, and those fragments are now in the National Museum. So we scanned each of those fragments, and then we were able to digitally reconstruct them to put the stone back together digitally. Another thing we can do is to print the 3D models, and I brought along a few examples of just miniature 3D printed Ogham stones, so if anyone wants to come up afterwards and have a look before they go, you're welcome to. So please do visit our website, and we'd appreciate and we'd be very grateful for any feedback, positive or negative or whatever. So you can also follow us on Facebook or Twitter if you're interested to see what's happening with the project and what we're at the moment. And all that's left to say is thank you very much for your attention.
Now, before you go home, are there any questions?
Yeah. Just seeing that Ogham hasn't been used since the 8th century, how do we know with any certainty what any of it means?
Well, it did continue in the manuscript tradition, and they kept the alphabet going, and a lot of things did survive, like the actual letters have survived. And it's through that we know what's written on the inscription. So you can use the medieval manuscript key, even though the letter names aren't always accurate. They interpreted them wrongly, but the letters are still. Now there are the three that I mentioned: the H, N, G, and Z. We don't know what those were, but the rest we do know, and it makes sense when you look at the inscriptions. What I always do when I see an inscription for the first time, I look for the mockery, because in most inscriptions you have this mockery, which means son of, and if you look for the one score diagonal, which is the M, the single vowel notch, and then the 5 scores to the left, which are a Q, and then the 5 vowel notches. And if you can identify that, you have your orientation, you can see where you are, and you can make out the rest of the inscription from there. We also have the inscriptions in Wales. Many of them are bilingual. So you have the Ogham inscription on the edge of the stone, as you have in Ireland, and then you have a Latin inscription on the face of the stone, which is equivalent. So this also helps us to confirm the letters and what they mean.
And there was no V or Z in the old Gaelic alphabet.
Yes, yeah.
Why your legs?
Exactly. That's presumably why they created this alphabet, even though they obviously had a knowledge of Latin. They created an alphabet that was for the sounds of the Irish language. Now, when I say V, it was written V, for example, on the inscriptions in Wales, the Latin equivalent of this character in Ogham was a V, but it was pronounced W, and it became an F later on. So it wasn't really a V, there was never a V sound, it was a W. So the word in modern Irish we have V, but it's a BH, or it's not. There's no V. We have the sound, but not the actual letter.
Thank you.
The first is, you said that the records of the Ogham stones just go back to around 300 AD, but that the actual alphabet goes back perhaps a few hundred years before that. So is the assumption that they may have used trees before that, before the stone, and would any of those trees obviously haven't been found in bogs?
You mean that they had carved on
They had
wood
carved
or
on tree, on
Yeah.
wood before the stones, and
It's very possible and even likely, because it would be really nice to find something that if something
nothing has
survived.
ever been found in the bog. That would.
Now we have found inscriptions on other materials and bone, etc., and different materials, and I think even on some wood as well, but they're from a later period.
Yeah.
So we have nothing from this early period that survives that we have found yet. Hopefully someday we will. But presumably they did, because the earliest inscriptions we have, you can see clearly that the alphabet is well developed, so they must have used it for something. So it just must not have survived.
Okay. And my second question is, all of these Ogham stones are presumably national monuments. And what's the position about bringing them in from the open and putting them into museums to preserve them? They will continue to weather.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. There are really quite a lot of them. The National Museum collection, they already have 50 Ogham stones, believe it or not, in storage, and they just don't have room for them, and they don't have the funding, the staff. They don't have any resources with which to bring them in. So unfortunately, that won't happen. Now, the odd one that's in danger. One of the things we want to do is monitor them. And if there are any that are in really serious danger of being damaged or overly weathered, then we can maybe look at bringing individual ones to local museums, perhaps, that would maybe have more space or whatever. But it's a difficult process, and you have to work with different departments, and so it's not going to happen across the board. But there may be a case for individual cases of bringing them indoors or moving them to more suitable sites.
Would it be nice to put them into schools?
I actually came across a stone at a school recently. It was moved from its site, which was nearby, and it was moved to the front of a school. And yeah, as long as the students do, know that the stone is precious and needs to be looked after. And if you educate them, they will. As long as you explain the story of the stone and the inscription, and give them an interest and a feeling of pride in their heritage, and that, then they will look after them. That's what we would hope for the future.
Is there not a list of them in Cork, in the stone corridor in
Yes.
UCC?
There are 28 stones, 27 of them from County Cork, one from County Waterford, on display in the stone corridor in UCC, and that's it's an amazing sight to see, because you don't see that many Ogham stones altogether generally. So it's an incredible collection. And there was, at the time when they were collected in the early 20th century, I suppose, there were some people who said they should not have been moved, they should have been left on site, but many of those were in suzerains. I mentioned that there was one suzerain with 15 stones used in the construction of the suzerain, and 11 of those are now in UCC. If they hadn't been moved to UCC, that suzerain would probably be now closed. Nobody could see it, nobody could see the inscriptions. You'd need an archaeological excavation to access the stones. So that really wouldn't be ideal either. They'd be safe, but unless we need to be able to appreciate our heritage as well. So we need to get a balance between the two. It's nice to keep them on site, but as you say, sometimes they can be in danger of weathering or vandalism or whatever.
You could imagine taking your van down to Cork or Kerry and saying to the locals, we've come to take your stone back to Dublin. You'd be lucky if you got your van back.
Well, I have a couple of questions on language. As the Romans pushed out of Italy into north and west, the locals got introduced to Latin. And we can understand with the Ogham stones in Wales that Latin would have been around since whatever it was, 80 AD, I think the first Romans arrived in Wales. Romans never came to Ireland as far as we know as invaders, but Ogham is based on Latin. So how did it get here? Who taught us how to use it? Who taught the poor stonemason with his chisel and his hammer, this is the way you cut it? And who could read it?
First of all, yes, they would have had to have knowledge of Latin, which I suppose shows that there was contact with the Roman world from much earlier than we previously thought. So there must have been contact with the Roman world in the early centuries before Ireland was Christianized. And I suppose, yes, the Romans didn't conquer Ireland, they didn't invade Ireland, but there was trade. There was an awful lot of trade and an awful lot of interaction between, the Irish Sea was a highway that, they were over and back constantly. So even though we were separated, it was a link as well, and there was a lot of contact. And to answer your other question, who would have had knowledge? Only the very elite would have had knowledge of, writing and language and that kind of thing. And who would have read the stones? The majority of the population, I presume, would not have been able to read them. So again, it's only a small minority of people.
Might the fella have been taught Ogham as part of his repertoire?
Oh yes, absolutely. Oh yes, the poets and the scholars, they would have learned. But this again would only have been a small minority of the population. Only the very highest ranks in society, would have got. I mean, not anyone could be a poet. It was a very stratified society, and only the very highest levels had access to that kind of education. So as to who carved the stones and how did they know how to carve them, I've often wondered about that myself. I mean, were they given, for example, a piece of wood or something with the inscription, and they had to copy it out? And it's very interesting when you see errors made in inscriptions, and you wonder, was this an error by the person who carved the stone, or was it the person who commissioned it, or how do you figure this out? So one of the things that we want to look at in more detail is the actual carving, the actual techniques used, the errors, the variation in style, and just to see if looking in detail at the actual carving can tell us anything. Now maybe it won't, but it's an interesting thing to look at anyway, and looking at the variation and see if there's chronological variation, or if it's more geographical, and just see if we can tell anything that could add to our knowledge of Ogham. And certainly in the archaeological context, there's a lot missing that we could still try to find out that might help us as well.
Has anything been found in pottery or clay?
Not that I can think of now. There are some Ogham inscriptions on metal objects and on wooden objects, on bone, amber. We have an amber bead with an Ogham inscription on it from, I think, around the 8th century or something. But we don't, not that I know of, there's no pottery that I know of with Ogham, no.
Can I just ask you, is there any records of Norman stone in Clonmorris Cemetery in County Leitrim? I'm sure there was one in South
Clonmorris, is it?
Clonmorris.
Yes.
Bornacoola.
That rings a bell, yes. I'm pretty sure there is. Now, I haven't got it on our website because I haven't recorded it yet, but I'm pretty sure if you look up archaeology.ie, if you go into their web viewer, give you the list.
I'm sure there is one.
I'm almost certain, that I came across that,
Yeah,
hi. I was just wondering, you know the large flagstones that you ground? The stone itself, I just wondered about these stones. They're very large, some of them. So would they have been found locally?
Yes, we would. A study hasn't really been done on the geology of the Ogham stones, which would be a great thing to do. But from what we can tell, it seems to be local stone predominantly that's found. For example, in County Wicklow, most of the Ogham stones appear to be granite. Very often you can tell that it's local stone, and it does predominantly seem to be local stone. They just use whatever was available. And the fact that Ogham stones come in all different shapes and sizes, they didn't prepare the stone very much beforehand. They just found whatever stone, that'll. I think what was more important to them was the location of the stone, where they positioned it, I think, which is why it's frustrating at times that we can't establish the original location, because I think that was what was more important than the type of stone.
Can I just ask you, did they move many of the boundary stones when they were moving them?
We don't know, you see, that's the problem. There are quite a few Ogham stones still near ancient boundaries as far as we can tell. But we don't know if, for example, ones that are at church sites, was the church site established near a boundary and then the stone moved in later. We just don't know, or was the Ogham stone there first? It can be very hard to tell. Yeah?
Can I understand you to say that the Ogham stones in Wales, they use a stem with the lines going through, and they were able to write on a flat stone, whereas in Ireland we seem to always look for the edge or the corner of the stone. Why was it so cumbersome in Ireland and more straightforward?
No, in Wales actually what they did was the same as in Ireland, the angle of the stone for the Ogham inscription, but then they put the Latin inscription in the Latin, the ABC alphabet on the face of the stone.
Oh, right.
So you had the equivalent, one on the edge and one on the face of the stone in Latin, in the Latin alphabet.
And why didn't they write Ogham on the flat by just using the stem instead of looking for the edge?
They actually started to do that later on, and a lot of the inscriptions in Scotland, which are, and there's more problems with the Scottish inscriptions, they appear to be later, they appear to be more 6th to 9th century, and they are very often on the face of the stone with a line drawn. Right. And you do have some examples in Ireland. I said they're very rare, but there are a few. And if you ask any sculptor, I have a friend who I work with on this project, and he just can't understand why they use the angle of the stone. It's so difficult to work with. Bits will chip off when you're trying to carve, and it's just the worst part of the stone to use. So
and it's 3D rather than 2D as well.
Yes, exactly, which is not necessarily a problem, but of course it's a problem when you come to cattle using the stones as scratching posts, and the inscription being worn away, and so it's not ideal, and we don't really know why they chose the edge of the stone. It doesn't really make sense. But maybe if we knew what the alphabet was originally used for, it might make more sense. But it's hard to get your head around it.
Sorry, the Welsh stones are highly carved, and the Scottish stones have lots of Pictish symbols on them as well.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
When I was starting out in school trying to teach me, my name was Mock Evoy. Would that be changed, that Mocky? But now, and then they changed it to Mock Evoy, no, Mock Fevoy. And then it was changed to Mock Evoy. But I still work out, I'm the son of, I think the son of the yellow one is the...
Okay, yeah. Well, the mock will definitely...
So the Mock will be traced back to...
Yeah. Well, yes, that is where our Irish surnames came from, the Mock and the O, the O'Briens, etc. That all stems back to the first attestations we have of names in Irish are on Ogham inscriptions, and the Irish were obsessed, I don't think it's too strong a word to use, with genealogy, and that continued from the Ogham stones into the manuscripts. I mean, the earliest manuscripts we have in the Irish language, the content is mostly genealogy. There's loads and loads of genealogies there, and it's full of mocks and O's, and that these were. In that time, they did mean son of and grandson of, but they became fossilized and became names, and they became our Irish surnames. So that's why so many of us have mocks and O's now in our names.
From that, yeah.
That's where it comes from, yeah.
Thanks.
Are there much of the personal names that are used in the inscriptions before the mock? Are there much of those still in use, the personal names? Is there any correlation between modern names, say like Brendan and older versions of the name?
I did give a talk at some stage on the genealogy and Ogham, and I did have a list of the names that are still in use today, so let's see how many I can remember. Fergus, spelled Vergosos in the early inscriptions. Another one is Culmon, which was originally Culum Magni. Ronan, you saw in one of the inscriptions there. I think that was originally an agni ending as well. Anything with an on, A for the N in Irish, would have originally in primitive Irish been AGNI, and that ending actually became on then in say Old Irish in the middle.
Is that like the AGNI you'd see in modern Italian?
It looks similar, and the reason for that, I suppose, is because they're all Indo-European languages, so they're related. Irish is related to Latin because it's also an Indo-European language. That's why, primitive Irish was closer to Latin than modern, much more than modern Irish is, because modern Irish has developed in a different direction and it has lost its endings and changed in different ways.
So they had steel tools in those days.
Another name that was a known.
That's right, yes, maybe it's in Oinagot, the Cave of Cats in County Roscommon. That's right.
They had steel tools then, obviously, in those days.
They have, and I was saying that I was working with a sculptor. What we did was we were looking at, we just took some of the stones in the National Museum, and he just had a look, and he was able to say, look, there you can see where the point chisel was used, you can see the pinpoint that survives even in these inscriptions that have been run for so long, that you can still see the marks of the tools where the point chisel was used, or the V-cut of the flat chisel. You can see the V-cut still there sometimes in the inscription. So we can tell, that they did use more or less the same tools that they use today.
Tool technology hasn't moved.
It hasn't changed so much. I mean, they
except for
still
cangos.
Yeah.
Well, the cango's still a chisel, driven by a machine.
Yeah.
Is there any significance in why a lot of them seem to be predominantly in the Munster area, down Cork and Kerry? Whereas that where the people who first appeared, or is that where the learning of Ogham started? And why is that predominantly where the stuff is found nowadays?
That is actually one of the theories, that it may have started there and then spread eastwards. Although some others have the opposite opinion, that it started in the east and spread to the west. So it's very hard to tell, but certainly when you look at the inscriptions, for example, you look at the Diggle Peninsula, which has the highest concentration of all very early inscriptions. You have some of the latest inscriptions, so they're from all periods. It seems to have continued in this area. So it just seems to be that some areas, maybe it's to do with the kin groups, because you saw there are a lot of the names, divinous names, recorded in inscriptions. Maybe this kin group were, particularly interested in writing and in the Ogham alphabet and in recording their names. Maybe they were particularly obsessed with genealogy. And maybe that's
scholars or something of their days.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So it might have more to do with the individual kin groups, that maybe Ogham was associated with certain groups, and that's why it seems to be bunched in different areas, particularly in the southwest of the country.
Looking at the map there, where you had all the arrowheads and so on, it seemed to correspond closely enough with mountainous areas of Ireland, and that's where you would get rocks and stones, particularly with edges and so on, and weathering, it collapsing. You'd have a nice bunch of stones out with nice corners and edges to them that you could work on.
That's true. It could be that. It could also be that in other areas there was more agricultural activity, and maybe a lot of the old stones have been lost in those areas.
Yeah, right.
So sometimes the distribution map, it mightn't be as accurate as we would like, because maybe there are more, or were more stones that are now lost. I know that a lot of stones were broken up and used over different periods, so a lot of them could have been lost.
Vikings could easily have done it.
They could, yes.